Hi everyone, I'm Gertie, and today I'm going to show you how to sew the Charm Patterns Betty dress. I'm so excited to introduce this pattern. It is based on a dress worn by the character Betty Draper in the TV show Mad Men. And that dress was actually a vintage dress from a Ward's catalog from 1959. This dress has so many details, like a beautiful ruched cummerbund, a bubble skirt, a beautiful round neckline in the front, and a dip V neckline in the back. And of course, for charm patterns, we love to bring you lots of options. So in the charm pattern, you will find a pencil skirt as well as a bishop sleeve. Today, I'm going to be focused on the cummerbund version with the bubble skirt and the beautiful fishtail effect bow in the back. So I'm going to take you through the pattern pieces, supplies, and fabrics, and then we're going to get right into sewing. So let's get started. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is talk about the pattern pieces. I do this in all of my Patreon videos and people find it really helpful. What we do is we minimize the pattern pieces, we scale them down so that we can see them all together, and I'm going to walk you through each of them and what they are. So that should hopefully help you understand how this pattern comes together before we start to sew it. Okay, so the bodice front and bodice back, I feel like, are pretty self-explanatory. This is from the bodice front and back. You would think this is a pretty simple darted dress with a round neck in the front and a V in the back. And then you have the yoke front and the yoke back, which gets sewn to them. And then what makes this dress really special, of course, is the cummerbund. So that's what these crazy looking pieces are. They get ruched, so gathered on each side and then overlaid over the bodice front and the yoke. And you can see how the yoke matches up to the cummerbund at the bottom. And then there's an overlay of the cummerbund onto the bodice front. Now, the cummerbund is supposed to be smaller than the bodice front to give you that really snatched look, right? You want it to really stretch across the body so that the ruching looks very taut, right? You don't want any baggy ruching here. So then you also have your cummerbund back, which is the same idea. It gets ruched and overlaid over the bodice back and the yoke. It does get caught in the zipper at the back. Okay, so the zipper has a bit of ruched cummerbund on it, which I will show you how to do, of course. And then we have our skirt pieces. Now these are going to look a little crazy. They have a curve at the top because they get gathered and sewn to each yoke piece. Okay, so that's why they have this curve at the top. They need to mimic the curve of the yoke. There's a lot of gathering in the skirt. It's very full. That's why these are so big. There is a cutting line if you want to do the gathered skirt as opposed to the bubble hem. If you don't want to do the bubble hem, I know it's not for everyone, you could do just a straight hem and omit the bubble. So it would just be like a traditional gathered skirt. In that case, you would want to cut along this line. But I am going to show you how to sew the bubble skirt today. Okay, so then the back is very similar. Keep in mind you have pocket notches here on both. You have a zipper circle on the back skirt, so just be mindful of all those markings. Now, the crazy thing about bubble skirts is that they have to have a lining that looks very different from the outer skirt, okay? So the lining actually looks like a traditional A-line skirt. And what happens is that it gets gathered at the top and gathered at the bottom, and then this gets flipped up and sewn to the bottom of the lining, okay? So you have a much slimmer profile inside the skirt that the bubble attaches to, okay? You're gonna see how it all comes together. It's very cool. And then finally, we have our pocket pieces. Very important to have pockets in your skirts. So you're gonna cut 4 of those. And then lastly, let's talk about this crazy bow. So this is based on the vintage dress. It took us many tries to get it exactly right, but I'm very proud of this bow. It looks nothing like a bow when you cut it, but you are going to cut 4 of these, and it gets, this is the sort of edge of the bow that forms that really pretty ripply effect, and then this long tail which gets inserted into the center back seam, okay? And then the top of it is going to get gathered with this little knot right here. So that's what makes it look like a bow. We're just gonna sew it together and you're gonna understand how it comes together because I know it's kind of crazy looking. All right, so those are all of your pattern pieces. I know it's a lot, but let's get in and start talking about fabric and supplies, and then we'll get sewing. Okay, so next I'm gonna take you through the supplies and fabric needed to make the Betty dress. Let's talk about supplies first. You will want a sewing machine needle. I like a microtext because it has a sharper point, but either a universal or a microtext, and you're gonna want it in a size that matches the weight of your fabric. So either a 70-10 or an 80-12 is probably appropriate for the recommended fabrics. And then you're going to want some thread. We recommend all-purpose polyester thread for garment sewing. You will need some little hooks and eyes, and this is to attach the bow. So if you're doing the bow, you'll definitely need these. And then you'll need a regular, as opposed to invisible, regular zipper that is 22 inches long. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the fabrics next. There are some utility fabrics that you need, for instance, starting with the interfacing. So the interfacing is just for stabilizing the zipper opening, okay? So I like to use these rolls of fusible interfacing, which are 1.25 inches wide. They're the perfect width for this purpose. You can also just use some yardage of fusible interfacing that you have on hand and cut it into 1.25 inch wide strips. Okay, so there's that. You will also need some lining fabric. I really like to use cotton lining for this type of dress because it's very breathable and comfortable. So just a lightweight cotton is perfect, or any other lining fabric that you have on hand. For the bubble skirt version with the bow, you will need tulle, okay? So we recommend a slightly stiff crinoline style tulle, and we will provide links to these resources. And then fabric-wise, there are a couple different directions you can go with your fabric choices. If you want to do the iconic Betty Draper look with one fabric and then a contrasting cummerbund, you will need your main dress fabric. And I love this dress in taffetas, shantungs. This is a really pretty taffeta gingham with little embroidered roses on it, but you could just as easily use a cotton broadcloth. We made a version in cotton polka dots that looked really cute, right? So that would be your main dress fabric, and then you would make your cummerbund and your bow in a contrast fabric that coordinates with that first fabric. So this dupioni with these slubs is a really pretty choice for that, or a taffeta, something with a little bit of hand to it, a little bit of body, right? For today's version, I got really inspired by a dress that I saw online. The same dress, but it was more of a color blocked approach. So the top of the dress will be in a cotton velveteen, and then the rest of the dress is in a sort of monochromatic, slightly lighter green taffeta. So the cummerbund, the bow, and the skirt will all be in that taffeta. Okay, so those are a couple different options, a couple different ways you can go with the fabric. If you want to explore even further into fabric, like using lace, shears, etc., definitely check out the instructions for the Betty dress, because we give you ideas and instructions for shears and lace at the back of the instruction booklet. Okay, so you can see my front bodice here, and I've already completed the stay stitching around the neckline, stitching from the shoulder to the center front and overlapping my stitching there. And I've done the same thing on both back bodices, which is a V-neck, stitching from the shoulder to the center back. And that's just to stabilize our necklines while we're working. Okay, so the next thing we're going to focus on is the bodice darts. We have two different kinds of darts on this bodice. The first is just your standard dart with legs that should be marked in. So what I'm doing here is I am making sure that my two dart legs are right on top of each other by putting a pin through and then checking on the back just to make sure that those legs align. Now I'm stitching up the leg of the dart, and I'm leaving a couple inches of thread at the very tip. Okay, now I'm going to tie off those longer tails here in a double knot and then trim them closer. And next we're going to focus on the other type of dart, which is the waist dart. In the instructions, you'll see we call this a split dart, meaning it has that triangle cut out just because it has so much excess in the middle of the dart just to get rid of some bulk. So what you're going to do is you're going to put the raw edges together, aligning the raw edges of that cutout, pin up the legs, and then you should still have the point of your dart marked in for you to stitch along. Okay, so I'm stitching up using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance and then following my marked line to the point and leaving tails. So I'm going to tie these threads off again. And I did want to mention a tip for sewing these darts. You want to be really careful around the point. So don't just veer off the edge of the fabric. You want to really gradually go off the edge at the very point. And your final stitches should just be right on the fold of the fabric. And that will help you avoid puckers at the point of your darts. And the other thing that will help you avoid those puckers is careful pressing. So what I'm doing here is I slashed open the tip of that dart all the way up to the point with the point of my scissors. And now I'm laying it over a tailor's ham to kind of mimic the curve of the body and pressing the split portion open. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put it over the curviest part of the ham to flatten out the point as much as possible. And then I'm pressing that point towards center front, but also trying to make it as flat as possible. And then with the bust darts, you can press them down towards the waist. So press them down for the body of the dart and then shift them over to the curviest part of your ham and press them down, also trying to get that point as flat as possible on the ham. And that will help you get really smooth looking darts. So continue the pressing for the back and then we'll move on to the yoke. Okay, so you can see here that I have used fusible interfacing to stabilize the center back openings on the bodice. And now I've done the same thing on my back yoke pieces. And the yokes are cut out of lining fabric. That's because they are covered with a cummerbund. So you just want to use the lightest fabric to avoid bulk. And what we're going to do now is sew the yoke to the back bodice at the waistline. And you want to make sure that you're aligning the center back with center back, side seam with side seam, and then matching up the raw edges. Make sure they're right sides together and pin along that waistline seam. And now I'm going to stitch this seam at 5/8 of an inch, back stitching at both ends. Okay, so here's what it looks like with that seam sewn. And now I'm going to trim down these seam allowances. And I'm just holding my scissors at a bit of an angle, which helps naturally grade the seam allowances. And next you want to clip into the curviest parts of the waistline, clipping in to your seam allowance about every 1/2 inch. And now we're going to press the seam up towards the bodice. And I find it helps me to have a tailor's ham, just to have a little bit of a raised surface to work on. And giving a little steam and pressing up towards the bodice. Okay, so you can see that I have done the same thing with my yoke front. I've sewn it to my bodice front. And now we're going to sew the shoulder seams. So you want to put the bodices, the front and back bodices, right sides together. You can see I almost flipped them the wrong way. So make sure that your center back is at center back. And then you're going to put your shoulder seams together and pin them. And then we're going to stitch these shoulder seams at 5/8 of an inch. Okay, now I'm going to press the shoulder seam allowances open. Okay, so just to review, the yoke seams are sewn on the front and the back, and the center back opening is stabilized with that fusible tape. Shoulder seams are sewn. Now I've repeated those steps on the lining as well. Shoulder seams are sewn, darts are sewn. The only difference is because I'm doing the bubble skirt version, there is no yoke attached to the lining. It ends right at the waistline. And I have also sewn my shoulder seams, but not the side seams on both the bodice and the lining. Now we're going to focus on our cummerbund. These are kind of funny looking pieces, so you want to make sure they're oriented the right way. Funny story, in the next few steps you'll see that I actually flip these upside down. I do go back and correct it later, but just so you know, I should have flipped it the other way around. So learn from my mistake. Be very careful that you have them right sides up. First thing we're going to do is turn in the upper edge 5/8 of an inch and press it to the wrong side. Now, these upper edges are pretty much exactly on the bias, so they're not going to fray, so you don't really need to worry about finishing these raw edges in any way. We're just going to turn them in and press them at 5/8 of an inch. And make sure you're measuring this part really carefully and taking your time to press. Okay, so I've done that on both sides. And now what I'm going to do is sew the center front seam of the front cummerbund. So I'm going to put these two pieces right sides together, and now that upper edge that I just creased, I'm going to unfold it, and we're going to start stitching right at that circle, which is at 5/8 of an inch, and stitch to the lower edge. Okay, so you can see I have those upper edges that we pressed in. They are now folded out, and I'm going to start stitching exactly on my circle mark, or really where your crease is, and I'm stitching at 5/8 of an inch around this curved edge. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is clip into this curve here about every 1/2 inch. Just right up to the seam line, but not through it, obviously. And now we're going to open out the two cummerbund fronts and press this seam open. So working on a hand because it is curved. And then when you get to the top, you're going to want to turn in that upper edge again that we creased earlier on. So you can turn it in, and then I'm just going to flip it around so I'm working from the wrong side, just so I can make a nice little neat fold at the top where we started stitching. And now I'm kind of repressing that center front just so it looks really nice and finished. Now the next step is to gather the center front of the cummerbund. So these are going to be visible stitches. We are going to do a line of gathering stitches to 1/8 of an inch of either side of the seam line. So you want to use a long stitch length and leave yourself long tails at the beginning of the stitching and at the end as well. So what I'm doing here is I'm just making sure that I'm exactly 1/8 of an inch away from the seam line using a point on my presser foot. You want this to look really even because it does show on the finished garment. Leaving those long thread tails. And now I'm flipping it around and doing the same thing on the other side of that seam line. So I end up with 2 lines of gathering stitches. These are long gathering stitches, remember, 4 to 5 millimeters. And there's 1 on each side of that center front cummerbund seam line. Okay, so that's my center front. I'm gonna wait to gather it up until we put it onto the bodice. And the next thing we're gonna do is we need to gather the side seams on the cummerbund front. And then on the back, we need to gather the side seams and the center back. So I'm gonna show you one of those. So I have the upper edge folded in, and I'm gonna start stitching at the very upper edge of the fold, keeping it folded under. And I'm doing one line of gathering stitches at 1/2 inch. And then I'm going to do the next at 1/4 inch. So 2 rows of gathering stitches right next to each other. And you don't want to backstitch on any of these. You want to leave a couple inches of thread tails at the beginning and at the end. Okay, so there's one front side seam done. I need to repeat that on the other front side seam, and then I'm going to grab my back and do it on both side seams and center backs. Okay, so now we need to grab our cummerbund and we're going to lay it over the bodice front. And we're going to gather it so that it matches. Now, you may notice when you put the cummerbund over the bodice that it looks smaller widthwise than the bodice, and you feel like it's not going to fit. Well, don't worry, because it's drafted to be that way. This dress is so unusual. What happens is there are some bias portions on the cummerbund, and once it's gathered and you're wearing the dress, the cummerbund will stretch to fit around your body and give you that really cinched look. So here's what you're gonna do. You're going to take the upper edge, the folded in edge, and you're gonna match it to the circle mark on the bodice, okay? So we're gonna put a pin there, basically just pinning my match points, and then we'll gather in between. I find that a little bit easier with this type of garment. So next I'm matching the notch on the cummerbund to the waistline seam of the bodice, and you can see there's a lot of slack here for the gathers. And then I'm matching the lower edge of the cummerbund to the lower edge of the yoke and putting a pin there. Now there aren't as many gathers on the yoke part of this cummerbund, so you're gonna see more slack above the waistline seam. And now I'm gonna start to pull my bobbin threads to gather until the cummerbund matches the size of the bodice underneath. So this is going to take me a little while. You really want to spend a lot of time on this and get your gathers nice and even and looking beautiful, because this is the focal point of the dress. So just take your time here. We will talk about gathering the center of the cummerbund next, but first I'm just going to have you focus on all the side seams for the front and the back. So just get those gathers looking really beautiful and take your time. Okay, so you can see I've gathered my side seams and I've pinned it to the bodice underneath, and I've also pinned it along the lower edge of the yoke. And what we're going to focus on now is gathering the center front of the cummerbund. Now, you will have a circle mark on the wrong side of your bodice, and that is the point where the center front of the cummerbund meets the bodice. So I recommend transferring that mark to the right side of the bodice, and I'm just using a pin because I don't want to do anything permanent here, like a marker, chalk pen or anything that's hard to get out. So I'm just using a pin to temporarily mark here. And that will tell me where my gathers need to end, where the cummerbund meets the bodice. And now I'm just pulling my bobbin threads from behind and starting to gather. It's a little bit tricky because I have several layers here with the seam allowances, and taffeta can be a little tough to gather. So this takes a little while, just spend a little time on it. You can also gather from the bottom of the cummerbund until you have a nice even amount of gathers and the upper edge of the cummerbund meets your pin mark. Okay, so then when you're happy with your gathers and the density of them, you are going to tie off the threads on the wrong side. So you need to pull your upper thread to the wrong side. So the way to do that is to just grab onto your bobbin thread and just pull it, and you'll see a little loop pop up at the base. And then you can put a pin through the loop, which will pull the upper thread through to the wrong side. So you'll have both the threads on the wrong side of the cummerbund. And then you'll be able to tie those two threads off together. And you'll see I actually triple knotted mine because I do get worried about them being super secure. So you're gonna do a few knots on top of each other to lock in the gathers. And then you can trim those tails close. And what will happen at the end of the process is that you will hand tack the cummerbund to the bodice at this point, but you don't need to worry about that until we get to the finishing section. Okay, so you can also tie off the lower threads as well. And then you're going to machine baste all the way around these edges, side seams, and then the lower yoke edge, just pivoting at all those points. And same thing with the bodice backs. You're going to need to do the side seams basting on machine and the lower edge of the yoke. Okay, so I have my cummerbund basted onto my bodice, looking beautiful. And now we can focus on finishing the neckline. So what you're gonna see here is my clean finish method for finishing a neckline with a lap zipper. And you've probably seen me do this on video before if you've watched any of my videos. What we're gonna do is match the shoulder seams first, and then you can fill in pins around the front neckline, or you can do it later. But we're gonna focus on the center back where the lap zipper gets inserted. And I'm gonna show you a method that gives you a really nice clean finish where the lap zipper meets the back neckline edge. So on the right side of the bodice, this is the underlap side of the zipper. You're gonna take both of these seam allowances at center back and turn them towards you 1/2 inch. And I'm gonna measure these two seam allowances to make sure I'm being very accurate here. And they're both nested inside each other. I'm gonna pin them. And worth noting, I don't think I said it, the bodice and the lining are right sides together. Okay, now I'm gonna focus on the left side, which is the overlap side of the lap zipper. And I'm gonna match those raw edges at the neckline. And we're gonna do the same thing here, except that the lining and the dress get turned in different amounts. So first I'm gonna grab the lining seam allowance and turn it towards me 7/8 of an inch. I'm just measuring to make sure I'm accurate here. And you can pin it in place. And then the dress seam allowance will get turned towards you 5/8 of an inch. Again, making sure I'm accurate with that little ruler. And so you should see a little gap between the two seam allowances that is 1/4 inch. Pin them in place. And now we're gonna stitch around the neckline. So you can fill in a few more pins. I haven't pinned my bodice front neckline yet, so I'm gonna do that. And I'm just gonna fill in pins all the way around. And then the next thing we're gonna do is take this to the machine and sew all the way around the neckline at 5/8 of an inch. Okay, so I'm using my normal stitch length for seams, which is 2.5. And I'm making sure I'm starting right on the edge of that fold. You don't want any gaps there. And I'm stitching at 5/8 of an inch, starting at one fold and then stitching all the way around the neckline and ending at the opposite side. Okay, so now you can see when we turn this to the inside, your lining won't be overlapping the zipper, so you'll get a really nice, beautiful finish on the inside where you will hand stitch the lining in place. So just a nice little finishing detail for you. Okay, but first we need to finish the inside of this neckline. So first things first, you are going to trim away any bulk at those back corners. And now we're going to grade our seam allowances. And the lining should be the narrower seam allowance. So I'm trimming that one down to about 1/8 of an inch-ish there. And then the dress itself can be a little taller, about 1/4 inch. So I'm going to continue that all the way around. Okay, so I've graded all the way around. And now one thing that you may notice, especially on sleeveless dresses, you may have your seams start to split after you grade them. So what you can do is you can go back to your machine and reinforce just along the intersecting seam lines. Go back and forth, stitching a few times there so that they don't start to split when you're wearing the dress. And now what we're going to do is we're going to clip into our seam allowances around the curves of the neckline. So about every 1/2 inch, you're going to clip in just around the curviest parts of the neckline. So definitely the front bodice. The back isn't quite as curvy because it's that V-neck. So really just concentrate those clips where you have curves, and this will help it lay flat when you turn it right side out. Okay, we're going to move to understitching next. One little thing you'll want to do before you understitch is you'll want to clip into your seam allowances again, right next to your stabilizer tape, essentially. And that will help you turn the seam allowances the correct way for the understitching. Okay, so do that little clip on both sides of the neckline. And then we'll be able to understitch. Turning everything right side out. There, I'm just doing that final little clip right here. And then we'll go to the machine to do some understitching. Okay, so at my machine, I'm going to turn those seam allowances so that they are underneath the lining. Okay, so, and you're going to need to keep checking to make sure your seam allowances are facing the right direction. And I'm going to stitch on the lining side 1/8 of an inch away from the seam line. And you'll need to keep spreading the sides open, holding them taut, and making sure your seam allowances are in the right spot, and continue like that all the way around the neckline. Okay, and now we're ready to press this neckline. So turn the lining to the wrong side of the dress. And then you're just going to use your fingers to just push out the seam line to the very edge, which will make the neckline edge look really beautiful and professional from the right side. And now we're going to use an iron to give a little steam and press the neckline from the wrong side. And continue like that all the way around the neckline. Okay, so now that the neckline is done, the next thing we're going to focus on is finishing the armholes. Okay, next we're going to focus on finishing the armholes. So flip the bodice back so that it's right sides together again. And you're going to isolate that C shape around the armholes. And first thing I'm going to do is pin the shoulder seams together, matching the raw edges. Now it may look like the bodice is going to be wider than the lining at the shoulder. Don't worry about it. Just make the raw edges match and it will all work out, I promise. And you're going to keep pinning around that C shape, filling in pins. And then the next thing we're going to do is take this to the sewing machine and stitch at 5/8 of an inch. Okay, so I'm just trimming some threads, and the next thing I'm going to do is grade my seam allowances, just like we did on the neckline. So the lining will be trimmed down to about 1/8 of an inch, and then the dress will be 1/4 inch. So I'm just going to continue like that around the armhole. Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing on the other armhole. Okay, so now I've gone ahead and clipped around the curves in the seam allowances. And I've also reinforced at that intersecting shoulder seam there, like we did at the neckline. And now the next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna pull the backs through the shoulder seam. So starting from the front, reach through the shoulder and grab the back bodice until you're able to pull it through right side out. And it can be a little tricky with a narrow shoulder like this. You might have to just try a couple times like I am here, and until you're able to pull and push the entire thing so it's right sides out. Okay, so I've got it turned out, turned the cummerbund out, and the next thing we're going to do, obviously I'm going to repeat that on the other side, but then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to understitch the armholes. It's a little different from the neckline because you have to do it in 2 stages. So you're going to start here, and then you're only going to be able to get so far before it gets too tight in that narrow little shoulder. So you're going to have to flip it around and then go to the other side, go as far as you can on the other side until it gets too tight. And that means that you're gonna have a little portion in the middle where there's no understitching at all, which is fine. But just go as far as you can on both sides and then press it, and then we'll come back to do the side seams. Okay, now that the armholes are finished, we can sew the side seams. So what you're going to need to do is on each side, the front and the back, you're going to want to open out the lining from the dress itself. Okay, so just open it out and then do the same thing on the back, and then you will match the side seams, right sides together. And now you have a few match points here. You have to match at the armhole seam. You want to make sure that those are right on top of each other, and then pin. And then you'll want the 2 cummerbund points to match, the front and back, so make sure that they are right on top of each other at the seam line. Then fill in pins as you go, and then the waistline down to the bottom of the yoke. And then the other side, the lining side, you want to pin down to the waistline. Remember, there is no yoke on the lining, so you're just going to pin from the armhole down to the waistline. And then what we're going to do is we're going to stitch in one continuous line of stitching, starting at the yoke, sewing all the way to the waistline of the lining. So one continuous line of stitching. And when you get to the underarm seam, you're just gonna have to pivot slightly and continue on. Okay, so now that we've sewn that seam, we want to press it open. And I'm going to start with the lining. I'm just going to put it over this ham because it is just a little bit curved. It always helps me to have a slightly raised surface for these areas where you need to isolate something. Okay, now I'm flipping it around so I can press open the other side. And you can trim away some of those gathered seam allowances if you want, just trimming them down a little bit to reduce bulk. And I'm going to keep pressing these open all the way up to the underarm. And now, when you look from the right side, you may see some gathering stitches there. You can always remove those now if they're visible. And there we go. So those, you're going to do the other side seam, and then we can move on to sewing the bow. Okay, so that is your bodice and cummerbund construction. And now we're gonna move on to that fabulous bow in the back. So we're gonna start assembling the bow. This bow is not traditional whatsoever. It has some really unique features. So I'm excited to show you how it comes together step by step. So let's go ahead and get assembling that bow. Okay, so the bow is stitched in 2 stages. The one side is going to be underlined in tulle, and then the other side is not, okay? And you have 2 sets of these. So start with one set, put them right sides together, and we are going to pin along one short end at the top here, and then around the curved outer edge, all the way down to this little point at the bottom, right there. Okay, so you have a lot of pinning to do here. Start at that upper short end and then continue pinning all the way around that long curved outer edge. Okay, so I'm stitching at 5/8 of an inch, starting at that one short end. And keep in mind that you'll need to pivot at the corner that I'm coming up to here. And then you've got this long edge to sew, and you're just gonna sew all the way off the end, back stitching. Okay, now we can trim away from the corners and then grade the seam allowances on that seam you just sewed. So the one that will be the shorter one will be the one that is not underlined with tulle, and then the one that is underlined with tulle can be slightly taller. So you're gonna do that all the way around where you just stitched. And then when that's done, we can do some little notches because we have a real curvy part here. And remember, on outer curves, you want to do notches rather than clips. So I'm just clipping away little triangles or notches here, just around the curviest part. So a notch about every 1/2 inch to 1 inch should be good. Okay, now we're going to look at the other side of this bow, the one that's still open, and we're going to stitch between those 2 circle marks on this side, and just between those 2 circle marks. So I'm going to pin this little section and then take it to the machine and stitch at 5/8 of an inch from circle mark to circle mark. And that means that it'll be open up there and then open below the circle mark down to the tail. Okay, now you can clip to each circle mark, clipping as far to your stitching as you can. And then grade down the seam allowances between the circle marks like we did on the other side. And next we'll be able to turn the bow right side out through one of these open areas. Just reach in and pull it right side out. And the next thing we're going to do is press this. So you want to take the seams and kind of roll them as far out to the edge as possible. So just take a little time and then press it flat all the way around. And then finally, we're gonna baste close these open areas here at the very top. So pin anywhere that there's an open edge on the bow, so at the tail as well. And then you're gonna baste on your machine at 1/2 inch using a long machine stitch. Okay, so now we're gonna take the 2 sides of the bow and we're gonna put them right sides together at this little center curved portion right here. So put them right sides together and then pin just in this section. We're gonna stitch at 5/8 of an inch. Okay, so now I'm going to clip into this curved seam allowance here. And then I'm going to press it open. So I'm just gonna put it over a ham here and press open. Okay, so the next thing that's gonna happen is we're gonna do a row of gathering stitches to either side of the seam line from the top to where the bow splits open at the bottom. Okay, so I'm gonna use a long stitch length and leave tails on both ends. And just like we did on the cummerbund front, we're gonna be doing a row of gathering stitches on either side of that center seam, about 1/8 of an inch from the seam. And as you're stitching, you just want to make sure that your seam allowances are staying open underneath. Because they're clipped, they can kind of start to close in on themselves. And then you're going to flip it around and do the opposite side. All right, and now we're going to pull up the bobbin threads to gather the center of the bow. I will warn you, it's a little bit tricky just because there are the layers of seam allowances, there's tulle in there, so it can be really stiff and bulky and kind of hard to pull up those threads. So you just want to do your best and just get it as scrunched up in the center as you can. Just go as far as you can, because we will continue to scrunch it up when we put the knot around the center and just kind of by hand gather it up in the middle. So don't worry about it too much, just gather it as much as possible in the center. And we'll use the knot to kind of scrunch it up like that. Okay, so let's look at the knot. That is that little rectangular piece. You're going to grab it and you're going to fold it in half lengthwise, right sides together. And then we're going to pin and stitch it around along this long edge here. Okay, I'm going to trim down these seam allowances to about 1/4 inch or 3/8 of an inch. And then you're going to want to press the seam allowance open. So open out the knot, the length of the knot here. And then I'm just going to place it on my ham, just have an elevated surface. And I'm going to center the seam allowance down the center of the length of the knot and press it open using just the tip of my iron. And now we can turn it right side out. And next you're going to press it. So center the seam line again down the back of the knot, just down the length of it. And now you can press it flat and you can press the edges so that you get a nice crisp edge on each side. And now we're going to take our bow and wrap the knot around the gathered center of the bow. And you can trim away any of those gathering threads. And just wrap it tightly and turn in 1 seam allowance. And then you'll want to kind of check it from the front and make sure that it's arranged nicely and that it looks good to you. And you can rearrange those folds and gathers and then pin the knot on the back. Okay, now the final thing we need to do is to just hand stitch the knot in place on the back. Okay, so we've just assembled our bow. And the next thing we're going to do is we are going to be inserting it into the center back seam of the skirt. And then I'm going to be showing you how to construct the bubble hem skirt. Now, I'm just going to warn you ahead of time that there are a lot of layers to this skirt, right? There's that outer balloon type skirt, there's the inner lining, and then there's the tulle, which goes in between the layers. So at certain points, there's going to be a lot of fabric involved here, but I'm going to show you as best I can on the camera. But follow the instructions as you go along too, because hopefully it will all start to make sense. All right, so let's get started with our bubble skirt. Okay, so now we're going to focus on the skirt back. So I have stabilized both sides of the center back seam down to the zipper circle. Okay, so, and I've also sewn the pockets onto the side seams. So I sewn them on at 3/8 of an inch and then pressed the seam allowances towards the pockets. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we are going to insert the bow into the center back seam of the skirt. So you want to grab both center backs of the skirt and put them right side up on your surface. And then you're going to take your bow and put it right side up on top of the skirt backs. And what's going to happen is the raw edges are going to match, and then you want that upper edge of that seam allowance, the finished seam allowance on the bow, to match the zipper circle on the skirt. So make sure that those are matching. So where we clipped into the seam allowance right there, you want to match your zipper circle on the skirt. You're going to pin there, and then you're going to continue pinning all the way down. And same thing on the opposite side. And then we're going to put these right sides together on top of each other. And we are going to match those zipper circles and the bow underneath, making sure those points match. Continue pinning down, and you want to make sure that those little pointed tails on the bottom of your bow, you want to make sure that those match as well and pin those in place. And then you're just going to pin that entire skirt back from the zipper circle down to the hem. And the next thing we're going to do is we are going to stitch this at 5/8 of an inch, and we're going to be sandwiching the bow in between the layers. Okay, so now that we have sewn the seam, you can see that we have the bow inserted into the center back, and then we have this little opening at the top of the bow, and that's where the zipper will be behind that. And the next thing we're going to do is turn this so that it's wrong side up, and we're just going to press this seam allowance open. Okay, so I'm just using my fingers here to get between the layers because there's the tulle and the bow and all of that. So just get between the layers, press those seam allowances open, and then press them open. Okay, so now we're going to sew the side seams of the skirt. I did pockets in mine, of course, so I have the pocket sewn onto the front and back skirt separately. And now I'm going to stitch the side seam, pivoting at the top of the pocket, stitching around the pocket, and then pivoting at the bottom and finishing off the side seam. The next thing you have to do is to clip into the back seam allowances at your pivot points so that you can press the pockets forward and press the seam allowances open above and below the pocket. So I'm going to do all of that off camera because these pieces are so big. And then the next thing we'll do is gather the upper edge of the skirt. Okay, so you can see that I've gathered the upper edge of the skirt already, and I did break my stitching around the side seams, about 1 inch to either side of the side seams. And that makes it a little bit easier to gather as well as get your gathers out of the side seams. I've also put a pin at center front just to help me match it to the bodice, which we're gonna do next. So grab your bodice and then we're gonna put it right sides together with the skirt. And I'm gonna start by matching the center front of the skirt to that sort of inverted V point at the center front of the yoke. Match those two together and pin. And then you'll see I'm going to do a few match points around the waistline, or really I guess the hips we're working on here because we have a yoke. So you're gonna match the side seams next. And then I'll want to distribute my gathers a little bit better between these two pieces. I seem to have gathered up a little too much, so I'm gonna pull a little more slack out. And then we can match the center back points. And again, you'll want to check that your gathers are evenly distributed. And now that opposite side seam. And then your final point would be the opposite center back. And then I'm going to go around and just fill in pins around where between the match points and distribute the gathers as needed, either making them looser or gathering them tighter, whichever you need to do, and making sure they look nice and even, and then placing pins all the way around. And the next thing I'm going to do is to stitch at 5/8 of an inch all the way around, and you want to make sure to pivot at that center front inverted V point. Okay, so now that yoke seam is sewn to the skirt, and you can just check that your gathers all look good, your side seams are matching. And now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to do the tulle, which gets attached to the lower edge of the bubble skirt. So it's going to be kind of hard to show you this because these pieces are so big, but hopefully you'll get the idea. So you need this long length of tulle, and we're going to fold it in half lengthwise. So you can see I've pieced mine here. That's why there's a seam. So it's actually a quadruple layer here because it was already folded once and then I brought the raw edges up to meet the fold again. So now I'm going to pin them along this long edge and I'll have 4 layers of tulle with a fold at one edge, which will give it that dimension that we need. Okay, so now you've got this long strip of tulle with a fold on one edge and pins on the other. You're gonna put it on the inside of your skirt, okay? And you're gonna match the pinned edge of the tulle with the raw edge of the bottom of the skirt. and you're going to start pinning it all the way around the hem. So the tool will be the entire length of the circumference of your hem. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to gather these together as one, okay? So you don't actually need to do a basting stitch because we're going to go right into gathering stitches. So your first line of gathering stitches will be at 1/2 inch, and then the second row of gathering stitches will be at 1/4 inch. And you can do the same thing that we did for the waistline, where you break it up into 2 sections, front and back, breaking your stitching at the side seams. Okay, and the next thing you're going to do is you're going to gather this lower edge, the tulle and the skirt hem all together up to the circumference of your lining. So you go ahead and assemble your skirt lining according to the directions, and then you'll gather this to that circumference. And then at center back here, it's important to note that these 2 ends of the tulle are not going to be seamed together. They'll just kind of butt up against each other. Okay, so here you can see that I gathered the upper edge of the tulle, and I've already gone ahead and sewn it to my assembled skirt lining. So you can see the skirt lining here, and it has been sewn right sides together with the skirt, which had the tulle gathered and attached to it, and sewn around the bottom there. And the next thing I'm going to do is to just fluff up this little a roll of tulle inside here by separating it with my hands, and that will give it the dimension to fill out the bubble on the skirt. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we are going to turn everything right side out. So essentially you got to stuff everything inside the lining here. So the bow, everything needs to go inside, and you're essentially taking the lining and turning it to the inside of the skirt and encasing all the other components inside. Like that tulle is getting enclosed inside between the layers. And you want to make sure that the bow is situated where it's supposed to be. And just get everything arranged. And then the skirt will be wrong sides together with the lining. All right, and the next thing you're gonna do is to take the upper waistline edge of your skirt lining, and you're going to pin it to the waistline seam. There you go, pin them wrong sides together, match any notches. And you're going to pin all the way around the waist. And you want to leave it free for a couple inches at center back. And you're also not going to be able to pin it around the side seams completely because of the way the side seams are sewn with the yoke, which is totally fine. Just ignore it. Just, skip over the side seam when you're stitching, and then everything will get neatly hand stitched at the end. So I'm pinning all the way around, and then what we're going to do next is take this to the machine, and we have a 5/8 of an inch seam line on the waistline already right there. And so we're going to stitch this at 1/2 inch, so it's right next to the seam line. Okay, so now we are ready to sew the zipper. So the bow can just kind of hang out down below the yoke seam for now, just kind of let it hang. And now we are going to focus on the center back opening. And the thing about this back is because you will probably have 2 contrast colors here. You will want to choose a zipper that works with both, the zipper color. So I found that pink looked the best rather than red, but I could have really gone either direction. And then the other thing is you're going to need to change your thread color halfway down. So when you get to the cummerbund, you'll probably want to switch to your cummerbund thread color. So that's a little bit of a pain, but it does look much nicer if you change thread colors. Okay, so the first thing I've done is I have turned in the right side, the seam allowance, I've turned it in 1/2 inch. And you want to kind of situate your ruching so that it looks as flat as possible. There will be stitching on top of the ruching, so keep that in mind. And then on the left side, you're going to turn in your seam allowance 5/8 of an inch, okay? And again, just get that ruching as flat as possible. And it's just part of the look of this dress that you will be stitching on top of the ruching. Okay, so first we're going to sew the right side or the underlap side. You're going to close the zipper all the way and place it behind that folded in seam allowance. And there will be a metal stop at the top of the zipper. You want to place that just below the neckline seam. And then you can just let the top of the zipper flip up, the zipper tape. And you're going to pin all the way down. So you're pinning right next to the fold and you're situating the fold right next to the zipper teeth. And then I like to place the pins with the head towards me so that I can easily pull them out as I'm stitching from top to bottom. And the lining needs to be kept free, both the bodice lining and the skirt lining. So make sure it stays out of the way of your pinning and your stitching. So pin all the way to the base of the zipper opening. And we're going to stitch right next to the fold. First, you can open the zipper about halfway, and then we're going to stitch right next to that fold. All right, so I've put a zipper foot on my machine so that I can stitch as close as possible to the teeth, stitching right on that fold of fabric. So I'm using red thread, and now when I get down to this cummerbund point, I'm going to backstitch, break my stitching, and I'm going to change my thread color. So I'm going to use this pink thread so that it matches my cummerbund, and then continue my stitching below that point. Okay, so thread color is changed, and now I'm going to pick up my stitching again right on top of the cummerbund. And now I'm just going to keep stitching all the way down to the base of the zipper. And around the ruching, just kind of arrange the ruching with your fingertips like I am here. And when you get to the zipper stop, you're going to stop with your, the zipper pull. You're going to stop with your needle down, put your presser foot up, and then close the zipper. And then continue on once you have the zipper pull out of the way. And then you'll continue on all the way to the bottom and backstitch. Okay, so now that the underlap side is done, we're gonna do the overlap side. So we're gonna start by pinning this, and it's important that you match your match points, like the waistline, the yoke seam, and the cummerbund where it meets. So I'm gonna start by matching my yoke seam, and you're going to take the fold of your fabric and it should cover the line of stitching that you just did on the underlap. Okay, so you're taking the fold and you're covering the zipper teeth and your last line of stitching, and then you're pinning to the left about 3/8 of an inch from the fold through the fold, the seam allowances, and the zipper tape below. Okay, and now I'm going to match where my cummerbund meets at the top. And now I'm going to fill in pins between my match points. And you'll also want to make sure that your neckline seam matches at the V point. So put a pin at the top and then continue to fill in pins down to the bottom. Okay, so now that I'm pinned, you can test your pinning by closing your zipper and just making sure that it closes and that it looks good and that your match points are matching. And you can also, at the very base, right above your bow, give yourself a little horizontal pin down here. That's where we're gonna do a little L-shaped stitching, top stitching the zipper. And you can adjust. I found that my cummerbund wasn't quite matching at the top, so I just scrunched one side down a little further to make it match. You want to make sure the neckline matches the cummerbund and then the yoke point. Okay, now we're ready to stitch the overlap side. I'm back to my red thread and I'm stitching at 3/8 of an inch. And the stitching will be visible, so I'm just taking it real slow. And when I get to my cummerbund, I'm going to switch colors again to pink thread. And now I'm going to be top stitching over the ruching here. And so the trick with this to make sure that it looks good is to just use your fingers as you're stitching, kind of pull the ruching horizontal as much as possible so that it's not, kind of ruching diagonally. You want it to be as horizontal as possible, and then it will look intentional. So take it slow and keep manipulating it with your fingers as you go down this ruching, top stitching it in place. And then you're going to stitch all the way down as far as you can. You can open the pull as far as it will go. And keep stitching until you can't stitch any further, when you get so close to the pull that you can't stitch any further. And when you're at that point, stop with your needle down, lift up the presser foot, and close the zipper just a few inches to get it out of the way. And now you're going to keep stitching to where that horizontal pin is that you placed at the base. And then you're going to pivot. My bow's a little in the way here, but you're going to pivot here, and then you'll finish off that L-shaped stitching at the base of the zipper and backstitch. And that's it. That's the overlap side of your zipper. Okay, so there it is, all finished. So you close your zipper, you can see how nice it looks, and then we just have the bow, which will be tacked up here at the yoke seam line. Okay, so finally we have some finishing work to do on the inside of the garment. So when you open your zipper, you'll see that all the lining is still free. So in order to do a nice clean finish on the inside, you'll want to do some hand stitching. So at the waistline, you'll turn the bodice lining in 5/8 of an inch and then hand slip stitch around the waistline. And then you'll need to do the same thing at the zipper tape at the bodice and the skirt. So turn in the zipper tape at the top, turn in the seam allowance, and then you'll be slip stitching the lining to the zipper tape for a clean finish. And then the last thing is the bow. So you're going to need to secure it by hand stitching. So you're going to take the bow, and then it gets attached to the dress at the yoke seam line on the left side, so on the overlap side. So do some hand stitching behind the bow. And then to get it to lay flat on the right side, the underlap side, you want to put a hook and eye there to attach after you zip the dress up. Now you can also do a hook and eye at the top of the V-neck between the overlap and underlap layers there to get it to stay closed nice and tight.
Okay, so that is your Betty dress. I hope you loved seeing how it came together today. Thank you so much for visiting here and watching. If you like the Betty dress, at Charm Patterns, we do a lot of vintage glamour patterns, and we also have a Patreon, which I hope you will come join. So as always, thank you for watching. I will see you next time. Goodbye.